We are back on the road to Reykjavik, and the final of the candidates matches Fischer against Petrosian. Now, if you remember, we left the match after 2 games. Very exciting start. Fischer won the first. Petrosian hit back really strongly in the second. If you want to see those videos, then do check out the links. You'll find them if you click on the eye up there, and you'll get to those. So game 3 was very tense indeed. Fischer opened with e4, his usual move. And Petrosian played a favourite system of his. So the French and the classical variation. Of course, white can close with e5 here, but Fischer liked to play bishop g5. Now, instead of bishop e7, which leads to these more closed positions after e5, Petrosian took on e4. This was a favourite of his. Of course, there's a great similarity with the Caro-Kann, which was also a great favourite of Petrosian's. So black has this very, very solid shell-like pawn structure. And but it's a little bit cramped behind the first 3 ranks, but that was typical Petrosian. And now we have this interesting variation where instead of bishop takes, also possible, Petrosian liked to play this recapture. You could say the main line of this is knight f3. Let's just have a quick look at how Petrosian liked to play this. And he would aim to castle on the queen side, which looks kind of a little bit passive. Let's just get to this position. So, for example, this was played in Clovans against Petrosian, Yerevan, 1975. So black is behind the first 3 ranks, but what Petrosian liked to do was actually later on in the game play with b5 and start expanding on the queen side. So actually it wasn't quite as meek as it looks at first sight. Of course, Fischer would have been aware that Petrosian liked that. Petrosian had also played like that in the 1960s. And he came up with this move, g3, which is directed against black's queenside fianchetto. Obviously not really possible to do that when there's some kind of discovered attack to open up this bishop. Petrosian played f5 to drive the knight away, and then bishop f6. So this is a more immediate way of attacking white centre instead of developing on the queen side. And it creates a little bit of a crisis for white in the centre, because you can see that with the knight on c3, it's not possible to support the d pawn with the c pawn. Now knight f3 is possible here, with the idea that it's actually possible to defend the d pawn like this. But Fischer played just knight e2, and Petrosian played knight c6, and you can see there is a big problem with that d pawn. Black just wants to take it, and it's not possible to support it with the c pawn. So this really forces white to push forward in the centre. At this moment, well, here's Petrosian's comment on this position. I should say that I'm using as a source this excellent book, Russians versus Fischer, which takes lots of old Soviet archive material. Was published in the 1990s. Very interesting book. I'm also taking annotations from, well, there's a superb blog by Douglas Griffin, and it's about Soviet chess history, and he's translated original annotations and articles from Soviet chess journals, and there's all kinds of interesting stuff there, but I've used some of the annotations that he's translated from some of the Soviet chess magazines and newspapers. Do check out that excellent blog. Okay, on with the game. So Petrosian commented, anyone who's been playing chess long enough can easily determine during a game whether one lost a pawn or sacrificed it. Fischer lost the d-pawn and soon had a hopeless position. Well, that's a very purist way of looking at things. But it seems, well, according to Petrosian, he felt that Fischer had simply made a mistake in the opening and, found himself in trouble here. So the d-pawn under fire, and so Fischer was forced to push it on. This was taken. And now knight takes. Also possible to play bishop g2 and you get some compensation there. Knight takes and bishop takes pawn. So black is a pawn up here. But it's not that simple, because white has managed to create isolated pawns here, and black's kingside pawn structure is compromised. So although Petrosian said that this is a hopeless position, soon had a hopeless position, well, hang on. That's, as I said, a very purist way of looking at the position. It is still extremely complicated. Because white also has a lead in development, and this bishop exerts some pressure on this long diagonal. Both sides castled. And Furman and Korchnoi in the Soviet chess newspaper 64 say here, there is no point in taking on a1. Black's position is good without this, while to give up the strong bishop, which fulfills important defensive functions, would be a shame. Yeah, well, if that's taken, you can see how that would really weaken black's king. You can play moves like f6, but that also opens up this diagonal. And white obviously has compensation here. It's difficult for black to bring these pieces across to defend. The knight can come into h5. This rook can also join the fray at some moment. Compensation. If you're a computer, you might be able to defend that, but it's not simple. Here, Petrosian put the bishop back on h8. He could also put the bishop back on g7 and on e5. In fact, Furman and Korchnoi thought g7 was better. Others said that e5 was better. It's much of a muchness, to be honest. Bishop e5 was played in a subsequent game between Spanish player Bayon and Marovic. Bayon won that game. After bishop e5, rook b1. Basically, white just has compensation here. I don't think it really matters where that bishop goes. So bishop h8 played. And you can see, the usual problem when you have double pawns, double isolated pawns, is that it's not just this one is potentially weak, but it's the square in front. You can see the knight can't be driven away. And also h5 is potentially available for a knight, and that was the problem with the bishop going to g7, of course, that it would be attacked by the knight. But also that square is available for the queen. Yeah, but for black it's the problem of how to develop these queenside pieces. Knight e5 played, so that comes across to just kind of pack the king side. And this is dangerous, very dangerous. And here's a very interesting moment. Fischer played the very natural move, rook a d1. He could have played in a very direct way with knight h3. Now Suetin, who was one of Petrosian's seconds, gives this line. After this, knight g5, obviously threatening checkmate. And after this, white can take on f7. Now if king takes, black runs into difficulties here. So there's a pin, this is a threat, and after queen g5, then the king gets checked up the board. And now a nice move, h4, and after this exchange, of course white wants to capture here, but it's not just this. The king is actually in huge trouble in the middle of the board. This looks very 19th century. king is about to get chopped to bits in the middle. But coming back here, after knight f7, in fact, rook takes is possible. And after this, queen g5 forces the exchange of queens. And in this position, although material is now even, this is actually very pleasant for black. Two bishops. The queen's bishop is actually going to come out very easily because the rook defends this pawn, c6 is possible, and the rook defends b7, so the bishop will come into the game on one of these squares. And then the rook comes into the game, no problems on the king side, two bishops, these pawns isolated, black is definitely better there. But in fact, coming back to this position, instead of knight g5, it's just possible to play rook d1. And white still has very decent compensation here. You can see black's problem is how to bring out that bishop. You can see the rooks control the central files. After this, well, black can do it, but once that bishop is taken, bishop drops back, comes around here. White obviously has decent compensation for the pawn in this position. I mean, black probably isn't worse, but it's tricky. There's, you know, some white's activity has to be contained here. Anyway, coming back to the game. So, you know, the idea, Petrosian's idea that somehow white's position was hopeless is kind of ludicrous. Maybe he was referring to later on in the game. Anyway, rook d1 played also gives white very decent compensation. Attacking this pawn. Oh, sorry, I leapt a little bit too fast. Queen f6 played. Now, if bishop h3, then knight takes, and black forces an exchange of queens. So that's why Fischer just stepped into the corner, and now he is ready to play bishop h3 and doesn't need to fear that exchange. If the knights are exchanged, then the rook is going to come to g1, and then we'll be able to take on f5. Obviously, white has very good compensation. So knight back to e7 to defend there. And Fischer doubles on the d-file, preventing an exchange of rooks here. Bishop h6, attacking this knight. Now, here is another crunch moment in the game. Fischer played rook d4, which looks natural to guard that knight, and potentially swing across to the king side. But Furman and Korchnoi say knight takes e6. They think this is decent for white. This move naturally slurs the strategic pattern of white's play. In other words, the blockade of the kingside weaknesses. But in concrete terms, it's perfectly acceptable. So basic idea is that this rook comes to the 7th rank. And they thought that white had decent compensation in this position. I think that's absolutely right. You know, black is still under pressure. I think I slightly prefer knight d5 actually. But in any case, you know, white has decent compensation here. But I think it's an interesting comment that Furman and Korchnoi make, that taking on e6 slurs the strategic pattern of white's play. I think it's a very good way of putting it. You know, Fischer was very consistent when he played in his his strategic chess, and maybe he just didn't consider it seriously enough. And you know, he liked to keep this nice positional advantage on the king side. But now, after this exchange, maybe he simply underestimated this exchange of bishop for knight. Petrosian drags this rook off to the side and manages to control the d file, or get some control over the d file. And now rook b1 was recommended by Furman and Korchnoi and others. So attacking this pawn and only then taking here. And, well, it's basically balanced play. But Fischer was in a rush here. He exchanged rooks on d8 and then took on f5. You grab that pawn back immediately. But this really gives black a chance. Because after this, rook d5, there is a problem with this pin. Maybe he overlooked that after knight h6, simply king g7 is very good for black. Rook takes, black is winning material. So after rook d5, Fischer had to play g4. But after bishop takes knight, then this messes up white's pawns, and that rook is looking good. I'm surprised that Fischer didn't go in for the queen and pawn endgame, actually. I mean, black is obviously better, but it's not that, I think pretty reasonable drawing chances. But instead, he kept the pieces on the board. Maybe he was thinking, well, Petrosian's running short of time, I should try and keep the position as complicated as possible. The problem here is that black's king is pretty safe. And white's king can be in trouble, and you can see those split pawns, isolated pawns, not very pleasant. Several of the Soviet commentators, Swaytin and Furman and Korchnoi, recommended rook d2. In fact, it's not that clear, and there's a very nice defensive idea for white here. A check and queen f4. Having said that black's king is safe, in fact, this queen can bounce around here, and let's just show you this idea. And this is enough for a draw. After this, it's perpetual check, and so on. Let's go back. So in fact, Petrosian's next move, king h7, although it was criticised as being a bit slow, in fact, very sensible. And here's where something slightly odd happens. I mean, many commentators said, why not just b5 here, for example, and just hold black's position and start the advance on the queen side. Petrosian played queen e5. The endgame is obviously very pleasant for black, considering white's shattered pawns. He repeated moves. Remember, he was short of time. And then he played rook e5, and then rook d5. And he obviously completely forgot that in this position, after queen e2, that would be a threefold repetition of the position, and so a draw. So here's Batyrinsky, who was head of the Soviet delegation. He said, when Fischer invited the arbiter over and told him that with his next move, queen e2, he wanted to claim the draw, Petrosian at first didn't even understand what it was all about. It was only after Schmid, that's Lothar Schmidt, the referee, had retired backstage to check the course of the game on the control set, that Petrosian began studying his score sheet closely. Petrosian had completely forgotten that would be a 3-4 repetition. Because he'd repeated this way with queen e5 and now with the rook, he obviously didn't see the connections between the position. Extraordinary. So basically Fischer escaped with a draw when in this position, let me just go back here, he could play on very happily. Look at white's pawns. Not good at all. You can imagine Petrosian getting to the time control and adjourning this position and then being able to just take his time in this position. It's not yet lost, but it is highly unpleasant for white to have to defend this position. So Fischer survived, and after 3 games, it was still even 1.5 all. Do check out the other videos I've made on Fischer's road to Reykjavik, and remember to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do consider supporting us as well through PayPal or Patreon.com. Thanks very much for watching. More coming soon on Fischer's Road to Reykjavik.